And Meredith, I see your chat message here. If you hover near the bottom of your Zoom screen, you should be able to click on the participant button. And I think there's a little up arrow that lets you change your name. Is that right, Colleen?
Let's see, participants, yeah, you go find your name and it go to the right and it should say more, and then that will give you the opportunity to rename.
All right, so to officially get us started, now that we've been through those couple little issues, welcome everybody to the ARE 5.0 sample test. This is a joint effort between AIA Miami and AIA Fort Lauderdale. We have Colleen Stovall from AIA Miami and also Amanda Rosenfeld.
Good morning.
Hi.
They are both huge helps and fantastic people to know down in the chapter. So if you're in the AIA Miami chapter, meet those people, work with them. They'll help you get ahead in life. And then myself, I'm Griffin Morris from the AIA Fort Lauderdale chapter. And we also, I think, have Maribel Ramirez, who's our executive director, on the line here. So the point of this presentation is to help everybody prepare to take the ARE and pass it. Today's presentation focuses on project management and opens with a 12-question quiz. So we'll give you guys 2 to 3 minutes per question to take that quiz, and then we will move on to reviewing each of the questions in turn. And that's what this slide says. So one other note that I want to give you here is that make sure you write down your answers, and if you don't have any idea what the answer is, make your best guess. It's better to guess than skip a question on the ARE, so better to take a shot in the dark than to skip and guarantee that you missed a point. All right, and with that, we'll get started here. I'm going to set a stopwatch, and every 3 minutes, we will flip to a new question. All right, so timer is starting now. I'm going to go ahead and turn off my camera while you guys look at this, if I can find the camera controls again. All right, and I'll let you know when we're at 2 minutes and 45 seconds. right, 15 seconds left on this question. And we're going to move to the next one. Got about 20 seconds left on this question. All right, and we're going to move to the next one. And if no one minds, I'm going to actually pick up the pace a little bit, and we're going to change these every 2 minutes. If that's going to be too quick for anybody, shoot me a chat message and let me know, and we'll slow down. We're at about a minute and a half on this question, so we've got about 20 seconds left now. 10 seconds left on this question. And we're going to move on to the next one. We got about 15 seconds left on this question. All right, we're going to move on to the next one. All right, we've got about 15 seconds left. And we're going to move on. All right, about 15 seconds left. We're going to move on. About 15 seconds left on this question. Okay, I'm going to move on to question 8. About 15 seconds left. Yeah, we're going to move on to question number 9. About 15 seconds left. And we'll go into question 10. Fifteen seconds left. And we'll go into question 11. About 15 seconds left, and then we'll move on to our 12th and final question. All right, and here we go to question 12. All right, 15 seconds left. Yeah, we're back around to question 1. All right, how'd everybody think that went? Good, bad, too easy, too hard? Anybody want to send a chat response or speak up? Okay, one person saying it went pretty good. Not too bad. That's great to hear. That means you guys are pretty well prepared. All right, so our question 1 is which of the following hazardous materials may be found in insulation products? Anybody like to make a guess? All right, with no guesses coming up, I'm going to reveal that oh, did I hear someone there?
A, asbestos.
That's correct. And we've got one person in the chat who identified the other answer, and that is F. So asbestos and glass fibers are the 2 hazardous materials you may find in insulation products in existing buildings. Lead is going to be found in older plumbing pipes. PCBs, or polychlorinated biphenyls, are found in old electrical equipment. Radon is a naturally occurring gas that comes from usually the basement or foundations. And then crystalline silica is found in masonry products. You can also find it in fiber cement board. Any questions on those? All right, let's move on to question 2 review. So this question is about the A201, the general conditions for the contract for construction. For project management, you will have to be pretty familiar with the contracts. So if you haven't studied the A201 yet, it's a great document to go through and just read over everything. So this question is asking what the contract for construction requires the owner to do. And out of those 4 options, the correct answer is to purchase and maintain all risk insurance. So all risk property insurance is required while the building is under construction. For answer B, the owner does not include the architect and contractor as additional insureds, but the contractor does include the owner and architect as additional insureds on the contractor's commercial liability coverage. So this makes sense when you think about it a bit. If the owner is going to insure the property against damage, they don't want the architect and the owner getting paid out for property damage that they may cause to the property, so they wouldn't include them as additional insured parties. But since the contractor is insuring the property against other damage that the contractor may do, they also have to include the architect and the owner as insureds on that because the architect and the owner come onto the site. So the contractor is responsible for them while they are on the site. Loss of use insurance, which was option C, is optional. It's not required by the AIA A201 contracts. And then professional liability insurance is required for the architect, but not required for the owner. There's no guarantee that the owner is a professional, so that doesn't make sense that they would be required to have professional liability insurance. One important note here that doesn't come up in these answers is that the architect should never give the owner advice about what insurance to carry. So you can refer them to an insurance agent or an attorney. You can tell them that the AIA A201 is a best practices document, but at the end of the day, the owner needs to make that decision for themselves. We should not be giving them advice on it. If we do give them advice and we end up giving them bad advice about the insurance and they lose money on it, they can come back and try to countersue us. So make sure you don't tell them what they need to do, just give them the document, and if they ask you a question, tell them they have to talk to their insurance agent or attorney. I'm sorry, any questions on question number 2 or insurance questions? Going once, going twice, and I'll move forward from there. If anybody has questions or wants clarification on any of the rest of the questions, just feel free to send a chat or use the raise hand tool. All right, so question number 3. This is a tricky one. It threw me off when I was restudying for this exam. The contract documents, which are comprised of the agreement, the conditions of the contract, the drawings, the specifications, addenda, and any other documents listed in the agreement, form the basis of the legal relationship between the, and then we have the options of owner and architect, contractor and subcontractor, architect and contractor, and owner and contractor. And the contract documents are the basis of the relationship between the owner and the contractor. My initial instinct was to say the owner and the architect because we're the ones who are producing all of those contract documents. But you know, when you think about it a little bit harder for a minute, it's obvious that it's between the owner and the contractor. Those are the drawings and the requirements of the work that the contractor is going to build. So one other important thing we could point out here is that under those contract documents, no other project participant, so that would include the architect and the subcontractors, is contractually obligated to another by the contract. So the architect produces the contract document, and then the owner and the contractor use that as their legal basis, but it doesn't obligate the architect to anything. All right, so question number 4 review. A university is planning to build a new science center to house its chemistry and biology departments. And I see I wrote hose its chemistry and biology departments, so please forgive that spelling error. The school wishes to encourage competitive bidding, but also wants to ensure the materials meet a minimum standard of quality. Which type of specifications should be used? Would anybody like to make a guess? All right, so if no one's going to guess, I'll tell you the answer is base bid with approved equal language. So this is a little bit tricky. Proprietary specs we can write off right away, right? Because that would be where you're specifying one specific item. You're saying this is the supplier you have to get it from. So that doesn't really give you competitive bids, right? Everybody has to go out and buy and install the same product. So at best, you're competing on labor, which is not going to give you a great variation in the market. Base bid with approved equals lets the contractor submit products for review by the architect and ensures a minimum quality is met. You can also list like several approved equals, or you can say this is the item and the contractor can submit approved equals. On the plus side for the architect, but not super related to the question, this does mean that the contractor has to do the research and submit paperwork to support their approved equal that they're submitting as a substitution. So that takes a little bit of that work off of your plate as the architect. So base bid with approved equals is the right route to go for this question. A descriptive spec would be the most open spec that we can create for any kind of project. The downside to it is it doesn't ensure a minimum level of quality, and it doesn't give the architect as much review power in the process. So the same problem comes up with base bid with alternates. So both of those would allow the contractor to make substitutions without review by the architect, and neither of them guarantees the product quality desired. So I would say when I read over the answers for this question, I was sure that it was either base bid with approved equal or base bid with alternates, but I wasn't sure which of the two was the best answer on initial read. All right, I'm going to move on to question 5 review. All right, so which of the following statements regarding arbitration is true? Would anybody like to make a guess? You guys don't seem like a guessing crowd this morning.
B and D.
All right, so the guess is B and D, and the answer is only D in this case. All right, so arbitration is generally less expensive than litigation, so answer A is false. Arbitration is considered binding and under normal circumstances may not be appealed. So the way it's written into the contracts the intent of arbitration is so you don't have to go to the litigation phase. So we do say that the arbitration is binding, and basically going to litigation after that is going outside of the contract. And then answer C is not correct because the initial decision maker is not a neutral party, so they are disqualified from being an arbitrator. Does that make sense to everybody? And just as a heads up, in most contracts, the architect is written by default as the initial decision maker, but you don't have to accept that. You can modify the AIA documents so that you are not the initial decision maker. That's a good thing to review on all contracts.
I have a question, if I may.
Sure.
On B, so if the agreement states that the arbitration is binding, so as you go through the arbitration process and you disagree with the finding, can you're not allowed to go back and contest that appeal or contest that decision?
Legally you can, but you're breaking your contract at that point.
Gotcha.
So the answer is, yes, you can say, well, let me clarify that. Under normal circumstances, you cannot. If you have evidence that you've been wronged somehow or other evidence came to light after the arbitration was passed, then yes, you can stay within the contract and appeal the decision later.
Understood.
Okay. So that's, I mean, the challenge with any contract, right, is it's only enforceable up until one party decides that they don't want to abide by the rules of the contract anymore. And then they can take you to court and try and show that the contract wasn't fair anyways. So it's a tricky process. All right, question number 6. This is a good one. So the critical path time for the following critical path method diagram is blank days, and they ask you to fill in the blank. Would anybody like to guess the number of days?
14.
14 is correct. So the way the critical path diagram works is we have to identify the longest possible path to get from start to finish on the project. So if we follow this set of arrows, then we have to add up 2 days plus 3 days plus 2 days plus 4 days plus 3 days, which add up to 14 days. If we follow the other set of arrows, so we could use arrow F and we can skip ahead here and we get 6 days plus 4 days plus 3 days. And that only adds up to 13. If we follow arrow G, we have 9 days plus 3 days, which only adds up to 12 days. So since 14 days is the longest path, that's the critical path. These questions would constantly throw me when I was studying for this exam. I always thought the critical path would be the shortest possible path because that would be the quickest you could get the project done, not realizing that the quickest you can get the project done is the longest task that you have to do, which is really still feels counterintuitive to me. Like I get the logic behind it, but I always think, the shortest path is the critical path and it's the longest path is the critical path. All right, so question 7. Construction of a hospital in the design phase this summer is expected to begin next fall and be completed 2 years after notice to proceed is given. As the development budget is prepared, the costs should be escalated to reflect the projected price. Any guesses?
A.
A is a good guess. The downside to it is that if we price the project based on what it would cost while we're designing now, next year prices will have gone up. All right, so Lorna is guessing C and Henry is guessing B. And the correct answer is C, in the middle of the project. So here's why. I'm guessing at the start of construction, that was my initial guess when I was rewriting these questions. Whoops, sorry. So the reason that we do the cost escalation in the middle of the project, first to explain what cost escalation is that generally there's inflation in the economy and then there's labor prices and other material prices that may be trending upwards. So a contractor on a project that's going to take them 2 years to build doesn't want to price it based on what prices are now. They want to price it based on how much is it going to cost me to do the entire job. So if they do it based on prices now, they're going to lose money on the work that they're doing, a year or a year and a half out from now. If they price it based on the end of construction, so 2 years out from now, then they're going to be making a lot more money than they deserve, and their prices are going to be too high. So to balance that, they will do the project escalation costs in the middle of the project. So the first half of the project becomes slightly more expensive to the owner, but the back half of the project becomes slightly less expensive to the owner. And then that evens out the losses and gives an accurate price. Does that make sense to everybody? All right, I'm hoping everyone's nodding or giving a thumbs up, but no one's on video. So we'll move on to question 8. All right, this should be an easy one, and this is a pretty standard one. So according to the AIA B101, which is the agreement between the architect and the owner is responsible for providing which consultant services? All right, and we have a guess of D from someone already, and D is correct. So in general, any information about the existing site has to be prepared and provided by the owner. That limits our liability as architects because we don't have to do that research. And then there's no chance of us having done it wrong. So geotech engineering, existing building surveys, any existing property information, we either have the owner do that or we have the owner hire like a property or real estate attorney to do that information and research. I'm sorry, to do that research for them and get that information to the architect. If your owner doesn't know any geotechnical engineers, if you want to play it as safe as possible, you can always provide them 3 geotechnical engineers that you're comfortable working with as an architect. If you've got a more casual relationship with the owner, you can tell them this is the person that we work with the most, and we recommend you contact them and contact 2 other people that you find on your own. So you can make a recommendation, but you can't tell them, this is the person you should hire, and you definitely don't want to hire that person under your own umbrella or under your contract. All right, and there's another question we're going to get to. I think it's our next one. Yeah. So this question has some similar themes in it. So question 9 is, a client requires an architect to work with the client's preferred mechanical engineer. The architect discovers that other clients have filed claims against that mechanical engineer. So to minimize exposure to risk, how should the architect proceed? And I think we've got someone who just guessed B. I looked away from the chat for a second there. Okay, now we're getting almost everybody guessing B. And B is the correct answer. So accept the project, but require the owner directly hire the mechanical engineer. So what this does is it protects the architect from what's called vicarious liability. So vicarious liability means the architect is legally responsible for all services provided to the owner through the architect, even the work of the architect's consultants. If the architect is not confident in an owner's recommended consultant, the architect should not take on that liability. So one way that we protect ourselves from that is we tell the owner, if you want us to work with that person, hire them under a separate contract. That way we're not responsible for their work, but we are responsible for coordinating with their work. This happens as well. So the firm I work for is Strang Design, and we do luxury residential housing. We frequently run into this when an owner wants to work with a certain interior designer or an interior decorator that they like, but they want us to design the house. Instead of hiring that interior designer under our contract, we'll ask the owner, hire that person separately. We'll coordinate with their work, but if you end up not liking the finishes that they've selected, it's not our fault, and we're not going to be liable for any of it. So it lets us kind of step away from any of that potential liability down the road. One other note on this question. So in addition to having the owner directly hire the mechanical engineer, the architect should request that the owner indemnify the architect for services provided outside of the architect's contract. So that's a modification that's in the AIA general, in the AIA contract document series under Part G. It's not a required portion, But if you see that that consultant has claims against them from other clients, you should ask the owner to indemnify you so that you've got even clearer shields against legal liability. All right, and now we've got one more legal liability question, and this is going to again connect to the previous question. So which statement is true regarding the AIA C401 standard form of agreement between architect and consultant? All right, so is the architect responsible for errors and omissions caused by the consultant? Does the architect, I'm sorry, if the architect must modify the design because the cost of the work exceeds the owner's budget, the consultant must also modify their design without compensation. Answer C, the architect is required to carry the same amount of professional liability insurance as the consultant. Or answer D, the architect is required to pay the consultant for the consultant's services, even if the owner does not pay the architect. So the correct answer in this case is answer B. So if the architect has designed a project that's going to be too expensive for the owner, and we have to redesign because of errors on our side, then the consultants also have to redesign and not receive any additional compensation for it. So they have to have trust that the architect is not going to put them in this situation when they sign the initial contracts. So to address the other questions, so for answer A, the architect is not responsible for errors and omissions of the consultant. So this is kind of a weird legal logic to follow, right? We are legally responsible to the owner through vicarious liability for the work of the consultants that we hire. So if we hire a mechanical engineer and they make a mistake and it costs the owner $20,000 to fix it, we're responsible for that $20,000, but we're not responsible to our consultant for their work being wrong. So we can then turn around and tell the mechanical consultant, hey, you screwed up and we just ate $20,000 for it. You owe us $20,000. So we can be sued by the owner for the work of the mechanical consultant, but we can then countersue because we're not responsible for their errors and omissions. We are responsible to the owner for their work though. Does that make sense to everybody? That's one that always kind of like throws me for a loop. We're the first person to be sued, but we can countersue. And that's essentially what this is. So the owner never directly sues any of our sub-consultants, but we can directly sue one of our sub-consultants. Basically what it's doing is it's setting up tiers of responsibility, right? So when the owner is concerned, the contractor is directly in contract with the owner, and the architect is directly in contract with the owner. So if there's lawsuits that are going to happen, the owner can sue the architect, the owner can sue the contractor, but the contractor can't generally sue the architect, and the architect can't generally sue the contractor because there's no contractual relationship between the two. And that's the legal concept of privity. So with the same legal concept of privity, the owner can sue us, the architect, and then the architect can sue any of their consultants for errors and omissions or other issues that have gone wrong on the project. But the owner can never directly sue the consultants. So when they sue us for the consultant's mistake, they're using vicarious liability. They're saying that we're responsible for the consultants and we agree to that and we're okay with that. But we tell our consultants, if we get sued for that vicarious liability, we will turn around and sue you. Confusing enough? All right, so that's vicarious liability and privity and how they work together. One of the other answers was, is the architect required to carry the same insurance? And the answer is no. Your structural engineer has different professional liabilities than you as the architect. Again, you're responsible to the owner through vicarious liability for that structural engineer's work. But at the end of the day, if they made an error or omission, you're not responsible for them having made that error or omission. So you can turn around and countersue them. So if the building falls down, the architect will be sued first, but then we turn around and countersue the structural engineer. So we don't carry insurance to cover for the structural engineer's mistakes. They have to carry that insurance. The pay when paid clause, this pretty much says, as the architect, we're not going to pay the consultants until the owner pays us. And if the owner's delaying payment to us, then we will continue to delay payment to the consultants. This sucks for them and isn't the most fair thing in the world, but we can't pay them until we have the money paid forward to us, and that's just the way the business is set up. All right, and the last answer there, so the architect is contractually obligated to provide a design that meets the owner's budgetary requirements. The AIAC 401 passes that responsibility along to the architect's consultants. So in our B101 agreement with the owner, we tell the owner, if you have a budget, we will design within that budget. Now, if you're an architect and you're not an experienced cost estimator, you should hire a cost estimator as a sub-consultant to make sure that you stay on budget with your project, because you are responsible for being within the budget at the end of the day. If you are not within the budget, there's 4 options that you can take. You can redesign, you can decline the project entirely, you can make add alternates and let the owner decide what parts they want to cut out of the project, or you can find a mutually acceptable alternative is the 4th option that's provided in the contracts. So obviously that 4th option leaves a lot of wiggle room for the owner and the architect to decide how they want to move forward. But for this question, the B101 makes us agree with the owner that we'll be within that budget, and then we pass that responsibility along to our consultants with the C401. All right, I think that's enough time on question 10. All right, question 11. So what is the difference between the statute of limitations, and I'm abbreviating that as SOL in the answers, and the statute of repose, the SOR? All right, a couple people guessing B, 1 person guessing A. All right, so the correct answer is actually C. The statute of limitations begins when a design construction defect is discovered. The statute of repose begins when the project is complete. So your statute of limitations is how long the owner has to take legal action after discovery of a design or construction defect. So this is a relative length of time. If the owner has occupied a building and they find the roof is leaking after, let's say, 7 years, right? If the statute of limitations is 3 years, then they have within 3 years of that 7 years to file a claim either against the architect or against the contractor, or both. The statute of repose says that once the construction is considered complete, there's a set amount of time for any claims to be filed. So complete is a term that's going to vary by state. It depends on where you're practicing. Some states define it as substantial completion, which means the project is able to be occupied by the owner, but doesn't mean that the owner has actually moved in. Some states define it by final inspection, so the last inspection the city needs to do to clear out the permits, and other states define it by date of occupancy. It just depends on where you are. So once a project is complete, if your statute of repose is 10 years, if no claims have been filed in 10 years, you're in the safe zone. If on the last day of that statute of repose, the owner does discover a defect, then the statute of limitations comes into effect at that point. So if the statute of repose is 10 years and the statute of limitations is 3 years, then technically your ultimate length of liability that you have to worry about that building as the architect who stamped the drawings is 13 years. After that, there's no possibility that any claim can be filed against you. Any questions on that one? All right, moving on. So question 12, a grocer purchases a market in a historic neighborhood. The property includes a small garden and seating area adjacent to the market. A clause in the deed requires the grocer to maintain the garden and keep it open to the public. This is an example of a affirmative covenant. So this question has a fake answer in it. There is no such thing as a prescriptive covenant. That's a made-up answer. A conditional covenant states that if the restrictions are not followed, the title will revert to the original grantor or grantor's heirs. A good example of this is the house I grew up in, and I'm originally from Ohio. There was a elementary school on a property that had a woods surrounding it. And there was a conditional covenant that the woods could never be torn down or sold off separately from the school. They had to be kept with the grounds of the school, and the school could use them for, like little nature trips and field trips and stuff. So basically that school had to keep and maintain those woods and use them for that. And if they ever decided to tear them down or bulldoze them, then the deed for the school, the land that it was on, would go back to the original grantor or that person's heirs. And since the land had been sold like 120 years prior, that would have been the heirs of the person. And then a conditional use permit is a permission from a zoning board to use a property for a special permit, or I'm sorry, for a special purpose. It's not really related to covenants at all or to property titles. So affirmative covenant is the correct answer, and that commits the property owner to a specific duty in the future. All right, so that's all 12 questions reviewed. How do you guys feel about the quiz at this point? Thumbs up, thumbs down. Any questions or any topics you guys would like discussed more in detail? If not, I've got a couple of sample questions that we can work through. And then I've also got, let me take this out of presentation mode and show you. All right, so the quiz that we've just gone through is the last 30 or 40 slides of a very long presentation here. So this presentation is based on the Kaplan books. It goes through all three major sections of Division 2 for project management. We have these set up for each of the tests that you have to take for the ARE 5.0. We can go through any of this in depth, or I've got, there's a couple of questions that are set up throughout this presentation that we can review. And I've got one question here at the end that we could review that takes a little bit longer to work through. So I can give you guys 5 or 10 minutes to kind of go through, take the numbers and try to get the answer. Or we can go through, any specific portion of the information that would be more beneficial. So if you guys want to talk about project manager responsibilities or contracts, or what was the third one? Execution and quality control. We can go over any of those three main topics, or we can start by doing that last sample question. All right, I've got one person asking for PM responsibilities. And one person asking for contracts. Does anybody want to be the tiebreaker? We have a third person asking for project execution. Another person asking for all three. All right. All right, guys. So we'll take the next hour and we'll kind of skim through all three topics. And if anybody wants me to stop, just send a chat message and we'll stop on a particular slide. So let me set this back to presentation mode. All right, so these slides all start by, I'm sorry, what was that?
One question is when you mentioned there's an error and then there's right?
I'm sorry, we've got a bad audio connection. Could you type that question up?
Okay.
Thank you. So you are responsible for the errors, therefore additional cost. So yes, so if we have a project where, let's say again, the mechanical consultant has made an error and that's caused a $20,000 change order in the field. The contractor charges that to the owner. The owner comes back to the architect and says, this was wrong on the set of drawings you delivered to me, so you owe me the cost of that. If the architect finds that that's correct and it was something wrong by our drawings, we should pay that. That will come out of our insurance cost. And then we turn around and we do the same thing to the mechanical contractor below us. And we say, hey, like, you just made a mistake that cost us $20,000. Like, that's a professional, that should be covered under your professional errors and omissions insurance. So they don't necessarily pay it directly to you. It's the insurance company that pays it out, but it's going to increase their insurance premiums. So yes, so the same way that we can cause problems for the consultants when we use the pay when paid clause, this same problem can be a big issue for an architect, because your insurance company has to pay out that $20,000, and then there's time that elapses, right, between when you have to pay that out and when you countersue your mechanical subconsultant, and they eventually pay that back out to you. So that's one of the other big dangers, right, is like, depending on how much money there is that gets paid out and what you're responsible for and what your insurance covers, that can be a significant additional cost. All right, so the presentations here are set up with kind of their headings and all of the subtitles that come down below that. So I'm just going to jump through those pages when I come across them. General PM responsibilities: coordinate between the client, the firm principals, your work staff, your design team, your consultants, your contractors, and any regulatory agencies, aka the building department and the zoning departments. Keep the project on time and under budget. And then, depending on project size, and this is an important one, the project manager should be focused on managing the work as opposed to doing the work. So if you're a project manager and you feel overburdened and you're spending 4 hours a day drafting CAD details or editing building plans, you should try to find more employees to do that work for you, or more drafters and designers to do that work for you, as opposed to actually being the one who does the work. If you're the project manager, you should focus on managing the work first and organizing all of that. That can be really tricky to do. I would say personally, the first couple of years that I worked as a project manager, it's really hard to get to get up out of the weeds and not focus on the details. Especially for me, it's easier to work on details and drawings because I was more familiar with those than I was with planning labor for the next month and a half to try and figure out our staffing needs. But it's key to focus on the right tasks when you're the project manager. Whenever you're assembling a team, you have to think about the type and complexity of the project, the size of the project, how much staff is available, what experience levels they have, and what tasks you can hand off to them, how much their billing rates are. So in most architectural firms, there's sometimes we use what's called a blended billing rate, where we say, the principals are this much, the drafters are this much, and we're going to charge the client hourly based on this rate that's somewhere in between those two numbers. But more often we'll tell them, this is the schedule. And if I have to have a drafter work on your project for 4 hours, and then a principal review it for 2 hours, and the PM has to put in an hour of scheduling all of that, then these are the different rates each of those people are charged to your project. People's personalities are another important thing to consider. And then the firm organization. So this slide talks about firm organization. So in a horizontal or flat firm, you get silos of organization. So a larger firm tends to organize like this, where you'll have like a dedicated admin and marketing department, a dedicated design team, a dedicated construction documentation area, and a dedicated spec writing group. That can be, if you're a small firm, this might be you have your admin and marketing person, your designer, your drafter, and then your specifier. In a vertical or tall firm, you can think of those as more being organized by studios, where each studio has that person inside of them. Or I'm sorry, each studio has that person assigned to that studio. You can also do these in a blended way, where you have, it's very common to see like Studio 1 and Studio 2, and then Studio 3 is the admin and marketing group. And it's not, they don't do the design and specs and documentation. So when you're a project manager and you have to assemble a team, obviously the client's a pretty critical part of that team, but then also the consultants, the contractors. If you're going with a construction manager, you might have to do the CM and the major subcontractors to them. And then any other firms the architect is going to team with. So for getting that team together, think about past working relationships, timeline of who to add and when to add them, the expertise of the consultants, the staff size of the consultants and their ability to get the work done quickly, and then the client overall wishes. And I'll give you guys a copy of this presentation when we're done. It's an online document, so as long as you're connected to the internet, you can get into it, and you can also download it as PowerPoint slides or PDFs. For scheduling, milestone charts are one of the easiest and simplest ones to do. It's just setting dates and saying we'll have this goal done by this date, and that will keep us on task. It's really good for small projects. A bar chart or a Gantt chart method. This is for medium complex projects. It has horizontal bars, and we'll see an example of it. And then the critical path method, we looked at an example of that during the quiz. So this is a good example of a milestone chart, very simple, just a timeline and some checkpoints. This is a Gantt chart where we can see different tasks that can be overlapping. So task 3 here can start before task 2 is finished. But we see task 7, task 2 has to be done and some time has to elapse before we can start task 7. Or maybe it's task 4 that directly makes task 7 start up. So you can draw these with what's called dependencies, where you have like a colored dot or a number here and a same colored dot or number here to show that task 4 and task 7 are related to each other. But for the most complex projects, are the ones where you really need to get the schedule as short as possible. Critical path management is the best option. So this is another good example. If the test question threw you off, I'd say kind of come back to the slide and read through and understand that the red lines in text show the longest potential path by adding up 2 days, 4 days, 6 days, 9 days, and then 4 days here. All right, this is a good example question where they ask you, an architecture firm is assigning staff to work on a small addition to a library. The principal architect has chosen a project manager and has decided to assign 2 interns to the job to assist with production. The PM is developing a schedule for the project based on the available work hours and the client's deadlines. Which type of schedule is appropriate? And would anybody like to make a guess?
It'll be A, right?
It will be A. So the project is small. There's only 2 interns. So we don't have a big team to coordinate on it. So a milestone chart is appropriate. The critical path method would have been correct if this was a more complex project or there were more team members, or if we had said that there was a tight deadline to the project and it needed to be done as quickly as possible. It's pretty rare for us to need the critical path method during the design phase of a project. And usually that's what these kind of PM questions on the ARE will ask you about. If they start asking you about a complex project in the construction schedule, right away to me, that's kind of a red flag that it's probably the critical path method. All right, a big part of being a PM is writing up a work plan. So that's a detailed project schedule that you break down into tasks and you assign to different staff members or teams. So here's a list of all the things that work plan should review. And I think I've got an example of one on the next slide. Yeah, so this is a little bit easier to go through. So you list all the tasks down the left side. You show how long those things are going to take and how much of the fee is going to be billed out to the client by that point. Now, you don't necessarily have to send the client this bill at the end of those 2 weeks, right? You could take the fee and break it down evenly over all of the weeks. I know a lot of firms that do that just so the client knows every 2 weeks, you have to pay us an additional X amount of dollars. Some weeks we're going to get a lot done. Other weeks we're not going to get as much done. Other firms though do bill by saying, you know, this week we spent 2 weeks with the SD design team, and we spent $1,320 making the SD presentation. So at the end of the week of 11/23, you owe us the sum of those two numbers. And then same thing here, right? So all of this work has been done in this area. So at the end of week 4 here, you're going to get charged for all 4 of these things. And then CDs obviously become much more expensive as you go through. If you're thinking about running a firm or starting a practice, it can be better to take that fee and split it evenly so that you do collect some more of that money up front. That way, you know, if I'm sure you guys have heard the phrase cash is king, but the faster you get the cash into your door, the more you can pay off any outstanding debts you have, which reduces your interest and financing costs. But anyways, this is an example of a work plan. And down here, it shows weeks or hours. So it shows how many hours a person is going to work and how many weeks that is, and then what staff members are assigned to that. All right, so whenever you're assigning fees to a project, you can do a top-down approach. This is where you estimate the total amount required to complete the project. You can use rules of thumb, so you can say, like I used to do work for university projects, and a large university project, usually the architectural fee was somewhere between 6 to 8% of the total construction cost. So if we saw a request for proposals from one of the universities and they said it was going to be a $20 million construction cost, we knew that percentage-wise, 6 to 8% of that is what we should be charging for our fee, and then we can kind of go from there. You can also do like per square foot costs. So if they said it's going to be an 80,000 square foot facility, you could say, okay, for my firm, you know, usually we end up charging about $60 per square foot. So if it's 80,000, then I can multiply that by 60 and I should roughly get this number for my fee. You can also do what's called the bottom-up approach. So this is where you break the project down into tasks, estimate the time that's going to be required to complete each task, and then assign employees and billable rates to it. And then you multiply those hours by billable tasks to get the fee for what's called direct labor. So the top-down approach is generally less accurate, but much quicker to generate. So when you're starting out looking at a project, I'd say start with a top-down approach and make sure it's within the range of what you would want to do. And once you're sure that you want to chase that project further, then you go into the bottom-up approach. It's going to be more accurate and let you figure out specific billing rates and how much time you can have each person at the firm spend on that project before you're essentially, you know, paying for that project to be done. So always use both approaches. Don't pick one and go with it. Writing up a work plan, again, is a really important part of a project manager's responsibilities. But the second, almost more important part is making sure you actually follow that plan. I can't tell you how many times we've written work plans and 2 weeks later we've blown our SD budget because we've spent extra time on that because the client had an issue or, you know, because we wanted to make the project better. It's good to have that passion, but that can really throw off the profitability of a firm. All right, and this is the example question that I have, which will show you like how to back out direct labor fees and how to do a bottom-up approach to figuring out how much time and hours need to be given to a certain phase. And I'm going to let you guys kind of review that at your leisure so that we can get through project management responsibilities and get into the contract and project execution portion. All right, so coordinating the design staff. If you've worked as a project manager, all of these things are going to be familiar to you and they're pretty easy to review. I'm going to kind of speed up on the review of project management stuff. I realize I'm taking a little extra time here. Keep the client involved when you're coordinating with them. Same thing, keep your consultants involved. Make sure you inform them of, you know, any extra information your client gives them their deadlines. Tell them if there's any other applicable codes than what you think they would expect. Code coordination. There's an art to doing this, right? You do it at different levels during a project. For the early coordination, think about your zoning setbacks, your use group, any area and height restrictions. As you get later, start paying more attention to the door location and door swings, fixture heights, signage locations. A good amount of this can be taken care of with like a good general details page in a set. I see we have a chat question here. Where can I download the PowerPoint? I will actually generate the link for that and send that out to you guys now. So I'll send this in the chat and then we'll send it in an email follow-up. Copy link. And there you go. And if you guys want to move through these slides faster and find some things and send questions, feel free to do that. So some
Griffin.
techniques, yes?
I believe you sent that privately because we do not see it.
Whoops, sorry, I did. All right, did that one show up?
Yes, thanks.
All right, so techniques for daily project management, project notebooks, physical or digital. Most firms I know of are doing digital at this point just because we're all working over Zoom or Google Meet. Meetings are always good, but you have to make sure you keep them efficient and effective. Keeping notes. I'm not sure why they make this separate from a project, or I'm sorry, this is meeting notes. So providing a sign-in sheet to know who is there. One technique that a former mentor of mine told me was that if you're a project manager and you're going to a meeting, you should always take a younger staff member to take notes and to learn how to become a better project manager. And it is true, it lets you focus on what's happening in the meeting instead of focusing on scribbling down notes as fast as you can. So I highly recommend that. And then watch out for what's called perfection syndrome. So the idea of this is that to go from low quality to medium quality takes a short amount of time. To go from medium quality to good quality takes a longer amount of time. And to go from good quality to great quality takes a long amount of time. You're never going to get a drawing set from great quality to a perfect set. If there's too many things on the building to coordinate, there's too many questions to consider. No drawing set will ever be perfectly coordinated and have all the answers that the contractor needs right at the beginning of it. There's too many variables to consider, right? If the contractor makes a substitution or the owner changes their mind, then the set's not going to be perfect anymore. So even if you do your best as an architect, there's too many outside factors to consider. So don't get too caught up in trying to make everything perfect all the time. Make sure it communicates your design intent, make sure it protects you legally and limits your liability, and that it allows the project to be built efficiently. All right, this is a good responsibility question. So an architect designs a public works project and employs sub-consultants for the design of the building systems. Pretty standard. The owner awards multiple prime contracts. So that's how the construction is being structured. Communications between the mechanical contractor and mechanical engineer need to be routed through, and they give 4 options: the general contractor, the architect and the owner, the architect, or just the owner. Would anybody like to make a guess? All right, I see one person guessing A on the video. That's a good, I like that, Roxwell, that was clever. All right, another person guessing B. So the correct answer is actually C. So here's why. The mechanical contractor is responsible to the owner. So since the project is a multiple prime contract, there is no general contractor. When the owner decides to do that, what they're doing is they're saying, I'm going to hire each one of these contractors for different portions of the project individually. They're all going to hold contracts with me. That does mean that the owner takes on that responsibility of organizing them. If the owner has some experience with construction, that's fine. If the owner is okay with some delays and additional costs, that's also fine if they want to just have greater control over the project. Since the mechanical engineer is a sub-consultant to the architect, any communication from the mechanical sub-consultant has to go up to the owner. The owner then has to send it to the architect. The architect then has to communicate down to their mechanical engineer and then back through that chain. Now, I've been in plenty of projects where communication starts out that way, but as things start to get faster or more specific and detailed, we end up with like just a single email where the mechanical engineer is directly emailing the mechanical subcontractor, but they're making sure to copy in the architect and the owner. So as long as the architect and the owner are copied, that's okay. But I'd say just make sure your consultants are never talking to the contractors or the subcontractors without you in the loop. That's a big potential for problems. All right, so that gets us through the major portions of project planning and management and into contracts. So I know a couple people had said they wanted to look at contracts. Was there anything specific in the contract section you want to review? There is a lot to cover in this section. I think the general conditions for construction are one of the trickiest parts. And then some of the details between the owner-architect agreement and the owner-contractor agreement can get pretty difficult. Supplementary and special conditions, a little less so. Architect consultant agreements are pretty straightforward. All right, owner-contractor agreements. So we're going to jump to that section. One thing we're going to stop at here, because it affects architects very strongly, is the standard of care. So this almost always comes up on the ARE in some form or another, and it's defined as the level of skill and diligence that a reasonably prudent architect would exercise in the same community in the same time frame and given the same facts or similar circumstances. So the information that you know at a time in a given locality are the key items to consider. Scope of basic services for the owner-architect agreement. Additional services that you want to add to that agreement are described there. Owner-architect dispute resolution. This is where we could go through the definitions of mediation, arbitration, and then litigation if neither of those are satisfactory. Understanding the compensation routes you can take as an architect. So fixed fee, cost plus fee, percentage of construction cost, or unit cost. Those are all good things to be familiar with. As a member of the AIA and architect, I do want to remind everybody, if you open your own practice, that is awesome, 100% I encourage it, but make sure you're compensated fairly. Make sure you're not engaging us in what's called a race to the bottom, where we're all trying to figure out, how we can get our services priced the cheapest. That sounds like a great way to get a foothold into the market, but what that's going to do over the long term is just devalue the profession. And that's all I'm going to say on that, because I'm limited in what I can say about that kind of stuff. But I encourage people, make sure you're getting paid what you're worth. And trust me, you're all worth a lot. If you've gone through the requisite school and passed these tests and logged all the AAXP hours, that's a lot of value. Okay, there's also a section in here for the owner-architect agreement for a sustainable project. Just as an aside, and I'm gonna step forward from there to the owner-contractor agreement. And I see there's a question coming in from someone. I'm gonna keep going until I see the rest of that question show up. All right, so the owner-contractor agreement. This goes through article by article and describes what's in each one and the critical points that you wanna pay attention to. So Article 2 just says the work of this contract. And it describes the work, or it describes that the contractor has to execute the work that's described in the contract documents. The contract documents do include the specifications, the drawings, and the conditions for the contract for construction. So you can use all of that to your advantage. If there's a clause in the conditions for the contract for construction that says the contractor has to provide you a construction schedule, then they do have to do that. They've contractually agreed to do that. And I've run into this before. Honestly, I think this is something I've hit more in the South Florida market than I hit when I was practicing in Ohio, but contractors don't always want to give you a schedule down here. If you have the AIA A201 as part of your owner's agreement, then they're legally obligated to give that to you. And if they don't, then you don't have to worry about them going off schedule. It's not your fault because they never submitted that schedule to you for review. You should remind them about it. I've got a question here. How does substantial completion fit in with TCO and CO? So a TCO is a temporary certificate of occupancy, and a CO is a certificate of occupancy. That's your permanent allowance to fit in. All right, so these are both covered in Article 3 for the owner-contractor agreement. Date of commencement is a calendar day or the day the contractor receives a notice to proceed. So in the contract document, we could say the date of commencement is June 30th, or we could say the date of commencement is the day the contractor receives a notice from the owner that they're released to start work. So we don't have to give a specific date in the contract. The date of substantial completion is defined as the date the owner can occupy the project for its intended purpose. So to answer the question there, if the owner has a temporary certificate of occupancy and they can occupy the project for its intended purpose, then that is considered substantially complete, even though it's a TCO. If a move-in date is critical for the owner, you can have a provision for what's called liquidated damages. Sometimes liquidated damages are paired with a bonus provision to complete the project early. But if there's a penalty clause that's beyond liquidated damages, it has to pair with a bonus provision. That's also a question that I've seen come up before on the AREs where they'll say, you know, true, false, like liquidated damages always have to be paired with a bonus provision, or a penalty clause may sometimes be paired with a bonus provision. So be familiar with what those two things are and how they differ. Article 4 is the contract sum. That's the amount that the contractor is going to get paid. Pretty straightforward. Article 5, payments. So this sets up how the owner pays the contractor. And it also sets up the critical part here that the amount of payment is based on the schedule of values. So the contractor has to submit a schedule of values to the owner and the architect that allocates the total value of the contract to various portions of the work. All of the ones that I've seen are set up where it's by specification division. So, you know, 00 through 16, and the other electrical and mechanical, and occasionally like transportation ones that come on later, site work in division 33, and they just allocate a certain sum to that. And then as that work progresses, they bill out that work, and you can track where that work's being billed. On larger construction projects, the architect has to do pretty dedicated review of that. I've also been on smaller projects where the owner says, you know, I'm just going to pay the contractor as they bill me. I'm not going to have you review these documents. And the owner can always choose to strike out a portion of this contract. And the last thing here that's critical is retainage. So typically that's 10%. If the owner trusts the contractor less, you can increase retainage. If you trust the contractor more, or if the cost of the project is higher, you can reduce retainage, and that number still stays fairly substantial. And retainage is just held back so the owner can always tell the contractor, you haven't finished the punch list, you haven't painted up all the nicks that you put in the walls when you were cleaning up, so I'm going to hold back this 10% of your final fee until everything is done to my satisfaction. All right, dispute resolution. So by default, the architect is listed as the initial decision maker. However, we don't have to be. We can say that we don't want to be and ask the owner to strike that out of the owner-contractor agreement. But by default, we are the IDM. Any disputes between the owner and the contractor go to the architect for review. Usually we have 10 days to review. After that, we can request additional information, reject the claim, approve the claim, suggest a compromise, or tell them that, I can't resolve this claim. It's outside the scope or outside my ability. You have to go to someone else, and that's when they go to mediation or arbitration. We've got a question for how is that documented? I would say written communication is generally how IDM claims are documented. Somebody should send you an email with this is the claim and this is what I think, and then you should have the other party send you written documentation that says this is the claim and this is what I think about it. A simple email would work. As far as I know, there's not a form included for dispute resolution or IDM claims. There may be in the AIA series. I'd have to look through and see if that's included somewhere in there. I've honestly never had to go through the process. But I would say 100% it should be a written communication. Definitely don't, have a conference call and make a decision. Or if you do, have somebody taking notes and issue the notes afterwards the same way that you would for any meeting minutes. Basically, nothing counts unless we have it in writing. Compensation methods for a contractor. Yes, to answer that question. So the contract that we're looking at right now is dispute resolution for the owner-contractor agreement. So this would be a dispute between the owner and the contractor. So the compensation methods for contractors have some similarities to the compensation methods that we have as architects: stipulated sum, guaranteed maximum price, cost plus fee, and unit price. And the next, you know what, I'm sorry, I actually have that in a different presentation. I think practice management goes over those 4 methods in greater detail. And I can include that link in the email that we'll send as a follow-up to this. All right, so that gets us through owner-contractor agreements. And I think that's what we wanted to focus on for contracts. Conditions for the contract for construction is, I believe, the longest portion of the contracts. This is usually in the presentation where I give people a 5 or 10-minute break. The whole presentation takes about 2 hours to get through. But I'm going to skip over some of these conditions for the contract for construction. If anybody sees something that they want me to stop and go back to, let me know. So one thing to consider, that because this is the general conditions for the contract for construction, this does outline the responsibilities of the owner, the architect, and the contractor. Since the architect has a contractual relationship with the owner and the owner has a contractual relationship with the contractor, this outlines any responsibilities the owner and the contractor have to each other. So the owner's responsibilities are set up in Article 2. Contractor's responsibilities are set up in Article 3. And some of the notes in here create what are called duties. So the contractor has a duty to notify the architect and owner in writing when errors and omissions are found or when code regulations are not met. So this is setting up any responsibilities between the contractor and the architect. Other responsibilities of the contractor there. And then Article 4 sets up the architect's responsibilities. So we have to visit the site regularly. We are allowed to reject work that does not conform to the documents. We don't have the right to stop the work if it's wrong, or if we observe a safety problem. We should notify the contractor and owner in writing. So that's an important one. If you're ever on site and you see the guys working without hard hats, you don't tell them to stop the work. You go over to the GC's trailer and you say, hey, the guys are working without hard hats. You're putting them in danger by doing that. I'm going to send you an email and follow up on this conversation, but I just want you to know, like, I see that and that is wrong. But as the architect, one thing we should never do is say, stop work on the site. These guys are being too dangerous. It's not our responsibility, as frustrating as that can be. All right, so a question came in. What if the contractor is not adhering to the drawings? So we can reject that work, but we should not stop that work. So in general, we should never go on the site and stop work. I did have an ethics professor who told me that if you're on site and you see someone who's at imminent loss of life, so somebody welding near their own acetylene tanks, for example, where they're going to potentially blow themselves up, like, yes, stop that person. That's probably acceptable, and the ethical ramifications are much greater than the legal ones there. But generally, when you're on site as the architect, you don't want to issue an order to stop work if the owner or the contractor can prove that you were overreacting to something that was happening. Like maybe you saw guys who were sitting for their lunch break and had hard hats off, and you said, I'm going to stop work because that's unsafe conditions for them. Then you're going to be responsible for the lost time in that project schedule as the architect, and that can be a big cost. So for the AREs, anytime it says, should the architect stop work, the answer should be no. All right, construction by owner or separate contractors. So if the owner gets frustrated with the work of the contractor, they can always step in and perform the work with their own forces. This is about coordination between contractors and the owner's contract or the owner's own forces if the owner decides to do work on their own. I include this as a light humorous break. Hopefully everybody's seen this picture before where the little dinghy at the back is labeled original contract and the big yacht is labeled change order, right? So as much as we can, we try to avoid change orders. That's where contractors will have the opportunity to charge a premium for their services. I will say that contractors have become very good at issuing those change orders. And one way that architects could learn from them is when our owners come back and ask us for additional services or ask us to redesign a portion of the design that's already been accepted and documented. We are not as good at saying, you know, we already finished that, so everything we do for that portion is additional services. We usually like to keep the client happy, and especially if they ask for a change that makes the design better, our inclination is to help them out and do that, right? But from a business standpoint, we should really focus more on additional services. And somebody said here, look for a book called Contractor's Guide to Change Orders. I will. That would be a good way to read on what the enemy is thinking, huh? Roxwell asks, an engineer specifies a particular product or feature. The winning contractor did not include that feature or product because it was over and above code. The submittal gets rejected by the engineer. The contractor submits a change order to add that product feature. Owner does not want to pay. Engineer is powerless because the base system meets the codes. Not so. So the engineer is not powerless as long as that feature was in the specifications or in the drawings. So the contractor has agreed when they sign their contract to build what is in the drawings or what is specified in those specifications. So even though it's above and beyond code, code is always a minimum standard of safety. We're always allowed to go above and beyond code. So I've run into issues like that before with contractors not wanting to add carbon monoxide detectors in places where they were specified because the code doesn't require them. I think that's the most common one I bumped into in residential design is we'll specify them in the garage because we think our client should know if they accidentally left the car running in the garage or if they hit their auto start button and the car started up. You know, that's a good thing to have an alarm for. And the contractor constantly says, you know, well, but you don't have to put it there. It's like, that's true, but it was on the drawings and you sent me a bid based on those drawings. So either you're saying you did a bad job bidding or you're saying you want out of the contract. You can pick which one you want, but you have to install those. They are listed on the drawings clearly.
So the subcontractor that supplies that piece that didn't include it, he is not entitled to the change order then. He has to provide it.
Correct. There's no change being ordered there.
That's exactly what I ran into, by the way, with a carbon monoxide detector, but in the rooms, in the high-rise residentials.
You got it. Yeah, if it was on the drawings, then it should have been in their bid. And if it wasn't, too bad. You know, that's their fault for missing it. And yes, this is also good. I'm sorry, FA survivability, I'm assuming is fire alarm survivability from whoever wrote that comment. Let me know if that's, okay, yes, that's correct. All right, so change orders should also, just as a heads up, be written by the architect and signed by the owner. Very frequently, I see those as the contractor writes them and gets the owner to sign them and then sends them to the architect and says, you know, this is the change order I agreed on with the owner. I'd say closely review those when they come in that way. Construction change directives. So these are sometimes confused with change orders, but they're different. So a change order has to be signed by the contractor and the contractor has to agree with it before it occurs. A construction change directive only requires agreement between the owner and the architect. The contractor can decide on what the price is for that later and issue a change order, but they can also decide not to do it and basically fight it. But in general, construction change directives are for larger, more serious changes than what a change order would be. So if those are not familiar to you, I'd say read up on them. It's important to understand the difference between them. And then minor changes in the work are things that are ordered by the architect that don't make a substantial difference in cost. So moving a wall 4 or 5 inches is a minor change in the work. It doesn't have to be signed by the owner. It's just, you can be the architect and say, do this, or, editing the paint color by a couple of shades, something like that. Okay, time and payments in completion. One thing that comes up all the time on the AREs is that contract time is always measured in calendar days. So if you say 10 days, that's not 10 business days. And if you say 10 days and that 10 days happens to include Christmas and New Year's both count as part of that 10 days. So just be aware of that. Mechanics liens, I'd say be familiar with those. Be familiar that the owner should get the waivers of liens or the lien releases before they pay out their retainage. And then the exact laws do vary from state to state. I actually can't recall Florida if the architect can issue a mechanics lien against an owner. I know that was something Ohio was pushing for over the past couple of years. And then this question goes over the trick to answering this one correctly is remembering that everything is in calendar days in the contract documents. So you don't have to worry about weekends or holidays or calculating all that stuff, which actually makes all of those questions a lot simpler. And that's how I usually remember it, is when I see a question about dates and I think like, well, what about Saturdays and Sundays and other days that somebody might have off? You can forget all of it. It's all calendar days. Article 10 goes over protections of persons and property and tells you what the contractor is responsible for. 10.3 is the provision for discoveries of asbestos and PCBs. So if the contractor finds those, they have to stop work and notify the owner or the general contractor if it's found by a subcontractor, and then the general contractor notifies the owner. Insurance and bonds. So this is one of the other very tricky portions of the test is just, I would say, read through Article 11 and really understand the insurance requirements for each of the parties and the bond requirements for each of the parties. They're confusing and complicated, and it requires you to learn a whole bunch of extra definitions, but it's part of the test and it's good to be familiar with those in any case. This goes over what the contractor has to carry liability insurance for, what the owner has to carry insurance for. The owner may require what's called a surety bond or a contract bond. So this is a company that basically agrees to pay debts if the contractor cannot complete the project. Uncovering and correction of the work. So if work is to remain uncovered for the architect's inspection and the contractor covers it, the contractor has to uncover that work at no cost. If the work's not requested to stay uncovered and the architect wants to review it, we can request it to be uncovered, but if we're wrong and the work is good, the owner has to pay the cost of uncovering. If we're right and the work was bad, the contractor has to fix it and pay the cost of uncovering. So that's one where you're rolling the dice a little bit if you're the architect. So if you think, you said to install the studs 16 inches on center and you look at the wall and the screw pattern on it and you say, those are definitely at 24 inches on center, right? You can tell the contractor, like, tear off some of this drywall and show me that the studs are 16 inches on center. And if they do, and the studs actually were at 16 inches on center and you were wrong, then the owner is going to be responsible for that cost and they're going to be pretty upset with you. But if you're right, then the contractor has to fix it and they have to pay the cost of tearing off that drywall. A good question that came up in one of the previous classes where I've given this presentation is who decides to uncover the work, who's the final say? And the answer is either one, because the architect is responsible for making sure that the work is built to the contract documents that were issued. The owner should be notified though, because they're taking on potential liability. The owner also has the right to reject or accept work that does not conform to the contract documents. So if I, as the architect, say, you wanted that wall built with 16-inch studs, and I think they did 24-inch spacing, the owner can say, you know what, like, I'm going to accept that, even if it's incorrect. So let's leave it as it is and not slow the project down. That's their right as the owner. And as long as we've notified them that we found that issue or we found that potential issue, we've done our due diligence on the project. Again, though, just to be clear, that's something that you would 100% want to get in writing. So this goes a little bit into, so up to a year after substantial completion, if the work's found not to match the documents, the owner can issue written notice to the contractor, and the contractor has to fix it at no cost. So Roxwell, if this is part of the issue that you're running into where they did something to code but not to the drawings, if you're less than a year out from substantial completion, you should be able to get the contractor to come back to site and fix it. There's a separate article in a subpart of Article 11 goes over. No, you know what? I think we're into a different article at this point. This should be Article 14, termination or suspension of the contract. Owner can always terminate for convenience. That means if they're just not having fun working with you and the contractor anymore, they can fire you, and that's that.
Real quick, on the previous slide, when you mentioned about they have to come back, and if they're within a year, does statute of limitations apply? That situation where you discover something, but the job is not done, but and they insist that they're right. The job is finally finished, and you still have your statute of limitation could apply at that point.
Yes, if you were in a situation where the statute of limitations, or I'm sorry, so what we'd look for is a statute of repose being less than a year, but statute of repose is usually between 7 and 14 years. That's in all of the 50 United States. It's more than 7 and less than 14. If you're practicing in another jurisdiction beyond that, I'd say find out what their statute of repose is. It's likely to be more than a year. The idea of the statute of repose is, let's say it's 10 years, right? The general idea is that there are some parts of the building, roofs, window seals, etc., that are going to degrade over time. So even if they were installed correctly, if they're not maintained and they're not cleaned, or if, like I see people pressure washing tile roofs all the time, and you're not supposed to pressure wash those over a certain PSI, and you're supposed to use a scrubbing brush attachment with them. But I still see people up there who just took out their own pressure washer and they're blasting water onto their roof system. And I'm thinking to myself, like, you're voiding the warranty and like gonna cause a leak in your house. That kind of maintenance or accidents can degrade the life of the building product, right? So we don't want to make the architect responsible for the building for the full life of the building. That's crazy because we can't guarantee that the owners are going to treat the building correctly anyways. So if the statute of repose is 10 years, that's where we're saying, after 10 years, we can generally consider that if there had been a defect with the building, it would have shown up by now. So after that, any defects that occur in the building after that 10-year point, those were probably due to just normal wear and tear. So it's that's the intent for the statute of repose. So it should be longer than that year after substantial completion. It should be significantly longer than that. So
but that really applies to if it's a defect or something like that. But is there a review of the contract documents after the job is done to make sure everything that was done matches up with what the contract document stated, and then find any deficiencies there? Because sometimes you don't pick up those things until you do a thorough review at the end.
You could require as-built documents to be turned in by the contractor. That is part of the standard requirements in AIA 201, that they have to identify to you any places where they made changes to the contract documents. They don't always do that though. So without hiring your own like building survey company, I'd say there's not an easy way to get a comparison set of documents that you can trust 100%. And that's, that's a big additional cost that I wouldn't recommend you take on either, because if you did do that and then you didn't catch something on the comparison, you could be liable for it. So that's one of those things where ignorance is bliss a little bit, right?
Gotcha. Thank you.
No problem. So where were we? Owner can terminate for convenience, contractor can terminate for cause, and there's a couple of reasons that they can terminate. Claims and disputes. So this goes over how the IDM process works. Notice that has to be given. Yeah, so there was a question earlier about the how is the IDM documented? And here we see initiated by giving written notice to the other party and the initial decision maker. So it's just written notice. Again, there might be like a particular form that the A201 lays out to use. But if so, it's not listed here. Then the initial decision maker issues their decision on the claim. If one or both parties disagree, you go to mediation. If mediation fails, you can go to litigation or arbitration, depending on what the contract says. All right, we're at our 5-minute warning for the class. So we did not quite make it down to project execution. We're on slide 110 of about, I think we almost got to 200 on this one. Yeah, so we end at slide 174, and that has some links for further reading. Definitely this first link here by Schiff Harden is a really good covering of some of the issues by actual attorneys, which is good. And again, this is all in the link that was sent out, as is the quiz that we went over today, if you want to take it again on your own. Amanda, do we have any announcements? We should have the what's it called? The AI in Miami version of this next month. The quiz night, right?
Yeah, we'll be hosting our trivia night
Trivia night.
April, and it will be in regards to project management. So look forward to an invitation to that.
So the way we've that we wanted this whole back and forth to work is AI Fort Lauderdale, since we have all the slides already built up, we'll do these presentations in 1 month, and then in the following month we'll have a little bit more of a social trivia night get together for everybody to do one more review and also do a little bit more social bonding as much as is possible.
Exactly.
All right, are there any other big questions you guys want answered, or I'm always open to feedback. If you think things could go faster or slower, or you wanted to see other things covered in greater detail, yeah, you can shoot me a private message. You can email me after this, or yeah, those are the two best ways to get a hold of me.
Again, where the contact information and the links, because I don't see it in my email, I don't think.
They should be in the chat window. You might have like a little orange button popping up on your Zoom dashboard for the chat. So our next class will be in April.
So
I'm sorry.
our next class will be construction and evaluation, which will be on May 8th. And that trivia program that Griffin did mention is April 22nd.
I would definitely recommend going to the trivia nights. They're good fun, and if you don't have a group of people to study with yet, it can be a good place to meet people who are on the same test, or can give you advice for taking the test. I know I was talking to Amanda before the meeting started this morning that both of us are already licensed, and neither of us has had to take the exam at home yet, which is an option. And I don't know anybody personally who has done that yet, but I know someone earlier said that they took it at home and it went smoother than a lot of people have said online. So that's a good sign. Practice management, we do have scheduled. Amanda, do you have that pulled up?
Management is July 10th for our Saturday session.
All right, and I just want to say thank you everyone for attending. Thanks for the questions and the back and forth. My email address is k.morris@gmail.com. And I'll send that out to the chat. And Angelica, if you're planning to take the test next month, let me go to practice management here. Make sure that's the most recent version of it. And I'll send you the link to the presentation that we have together here. And if I'm remembering right, there should be a quiz at the end of this section. I'm going to let it load up for a minute here. I do not have a quiz added to the end of this one yet. I swear I did. Oh no, I've done programming and analysis. Okay, I'll send you the link anyways. Here's the link for practice management. All right, that brings us to a close here. So thanks everybody. Send me an email if you've got further questions or you have any issues accessing those two presentations we sent out, and hopefully I'll see you again next month at the trivia night and the following month at the next class.
Thanks, Griffin.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Appreciate it, Griffin. Great class.
Anytime, thanks.